I'm Michelle Shoemate, and this is the Sustained Collaboration Podcast, sponsored by the Sustained Collaboration Network. I'm a professor, consultant, and researcher who's dedicated her career to studying and improving collaboration among social impact leaders. As a result of this work, I'm convinced that collaboration is an underutilized tool for making a bigger difference in communities. On this podcast, I'll be highlighting insights from recent case study research on nonprofit collaboration, available at sustainedcollab.org. On this episode of the podcast, we're talking about asset transfers. Asset transfers occur when one nonprofit organization transfers a part of its assets to another organization. That sounds pretty banal, but it can also be an important tool for helping programs that are not really aligned with their home organization anymore find a better home and make a bigger social impact. In this episode, I talked to leaders of two different organizations, the Asian Youth Center and Share Our Food, both of which engaged in an asset transfer with another organization, both of which grew the program that was transferred to them as a result and made it more sustainable over time. I think that asset transfers are potentially one of the most underused tools in the nonprofit sector when it comes to program level impacts. And I know that after listening to this episode, you'll never think of them as a banal legal venture again because of the amazing ways that these stories unfold. All right. Thank you so much for being here. Why don't we just start with you introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your practice?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here, first of all. My name is Laura Solomon, and I am an attorney, and I have focused on representing charitable and other tax-exempt organizations and philanthropic people for my whole career, which is about 31 years so far. And I have a firm devoted just to those groups. And we act as outside counsel to hundreds of organizations throughout the country, throughout the world. And interestingly, a significant and growing portion of our practice is just in the area of nonprofit affiliations of every kind, including asset transfers, the kind that we're going to talk about today, but also mergers and changes of control and co-located spaces, and basically all the ways that charitable organizations are figuring out how to work together to further their collective missions.
And your expertise is why you were such a wonderful part of the report. You get highlighted in the report several times. But today we're going to focus primarily on asset transfers. And I find that as I'm talking to nonprofits about the different ways that they can affiliate, asset transfers don't come up very much. So maybe we could just start by talking about what is an asset transfer and how is it different from those other kinds of affiliations you mentioned?
Sure. And it's really interesting that there's not as much information about asset transfers out there. So again, I'm really happy we're talking about it today. An asset transfer can be a really elegant way of combining part of one organization with another organization. And essentially it's a grant. It's a grant of assets in some form from charity A to charity B. And those assets could be funds. It could be an endowment fund to continue a scholarship program. It could be real estate to operate a program for children after school. It could be curriculum. It could be other kinds of intellectual property. It could even just be a program as a whole, essentially moved from one charity to another. So it enables two organizations to combine in part without doing a full merger, which is where two organizations combine completely, or a change of control where one organization becomes the parent of another.
And I think one of the things that people don't realize is that it's possible to take a program that perhaps doesn't fit very well in your organization anymore because you've made some strategy shifts or you found that it no longer is really your core competency. And people think, well, we just have to disband the program, even though it's doing great work. And then that becomes an internal struggle sometimes. And so asset transfers offer the opportunity to move that program from one organization to another.
Yeah. And I would just say on that point that and again, I'm coming at this from a lawyer position, obviously, or from a legal position, obviously. The job of the board of directors of a charitable organization and the senior staff certainly is a fiduciary one. That obligation means you have to use and maximize charitable assets all the time. And so therefore, as you've noted, if you're part of leadership of one nonprofit and the program isn't, making sense for that nonprofit any longer, or perhaps they don't have the resources to continue it, or it's not a fit for their current mission, I would go as far as to say that not only, should they consider an asset transfer or grant to another charity, I think they're legally required to. In other words, it's a little bit like recycling something versus putting it in the garbage, right? I mean, we all have an obligation to essentially repurpose, maximize, and figure out whether there's another steward for these charitable assets who can take good care of them and continue them to serve the public.
Well, what are some of the advantages of asset transfers as a mechanism versus some of the other types of affiliation, whether that be a full merger or a change in ownership? Why would you choose an asset transfer over some of the other types of integration?
So there are definitely some pros and potentially some cons here. And I'll say that the perspective of the form of the transaction, whether it's an asset transfer or a merger, will depend very much on the organization, its financial health, and whether it's in the position of granting the program or potentially receiving it. So with that caveat, I would say that the primary advantage of an asset transfer is just the discrete way that you can isolate a program or assets and simply move that over, right? So that the receiving charity is taking just that program, just that piece of real estate, just that intellectual property, and not absorbing an entire organization. So that can be advantage, certainly from the receiving charity's perspective. It also means that due diligence is not as in depth. It's going to be quicker and easier because you're really just doing due diligence on that asset and not on a complete charitable organization. If, for example, I'm taking on a piece of real estate, my due diligence would be looking at environmental surveys, making sure there are no liens on the property, assessing the value of and the condition of the property overall, and that's it. Whereas if I'm doing due diligence on an entire organization, I'm asking for articles and bylaws and minutes and contracts and litigation reports and obviously doing both a broader and a deeper assessment. So the due diligence is going to be, I don't want to say shallow, but less intense and therefore cheaper and easier, candidly. Also from the grantee, that is the surviving charity perspective, if it's done correctly, you're getting these assets without liabilities, right? And that's in contrast to a true merger where one organization merges into another. In that form of an affiliation transaction, the surviving charity is getting all of the assets and also potentially the liabilities. So if, for example, the merging charity didn't contribute enough money into the 403B plan, right? The surviving entity inherits that. If the merging organization didn't pay payroll taxes or had some other lawsuit out there, the inheriting charity, again, inherits all of that. By contrast, in an asset transfer, I'm just getting the assets. I'm just getting that piece of real estate or that intellectual property. Another advantage is timeline and complexity, potentially. If I'm taking a small portion of the assets of a charity, then that charity that's granting the assets probably doesn't need to get court approval or notify the Attorney General's office in that state, because typically those regulatory approvals are triggered when a charity is transferring substantially all of the assets. Depending on the state, that usually means more than a majority. So again, if I'm just taking a discrete little program, then the granting charity doesn't need to notify the AG's office, doesn't need to get court approval. And that is significant both in terms of cost, right? We don't need to go through those additional legal hurdles, and also timing. In states where you do have court and or Attorney General approval, that can take anywhere from 4 to 24 months, right? So if I'm taking a small portion of the assets, less due diligence, hopefully I'm getting the assets without liabilities if I've done that due diligence correctly. And if the assets are not all of the assets of the granting charity. I don't have to notify the AG's office and I don't need to get court approval. So those are really significant. From the perspective of the granting charity, right, that charity that no longer wants or is able to operate that program, it's also really an elegant solution because it enables that charity to grant just that program and keep operating. So to your point, if I have a suite of other programs that are working really well for us, but this one is a bit of an orphan, I can essentially peel that off, give it to another charity that can take the baton and run with it. And I can then focus on my core mission and continue to operate the remaining programs. So it can be a perfect solution for both parties, but for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, maybe we can make this a little bit more specific. One of the two asset transfers that we're featuring in this episode is the one between Uplift Solutions and Share Food Program, which I know that you're familiar with. So tell me a little bit about why an asset transfer was really the right solution for moving Philly Food Rescue from one organization to another. And were there any kind of wrinkles or complications that, might help us to understand what an asset transfer is better?
Yeah, I think that the Uplift Solutions Share Food Program transaction really exemplified all of those pros and cons that I just highlighted. This was a situation where Uplift had a terrific program, right? Philly Food Rescue. It had determined that it was not in a position to continue to run it and expand it, but it wanted to continue to exist and operate. And my client, Share Food Program, which already has a thriving, really healthy organization, saw the integration of Philly Food Rescue as a natural extension of the current programs and mission, and one that could really amplify it. And that's exactly what it did. So both parties were in alignment on the form of the transaction, and Uplift did exactly what we've been discussing, which is they granted this program and the intellectual property over to Share. So it was really a perfect structure. Now, in that situation, as in others where a program is being transferred with any intellectual property, there was an underlying license agreement that we had to pay attention to and negotiate, because whenever you're transferring a contract of any kind, you need to look at the contract and determine, is it assignable or transferable? If so, is it with the owner's written consent or not? So we needed to work through that issue. I wouldn't call it a wrinkle, but rather, a typical detail for a transaction like this. But once we did that and we just fully negotiated I think a pretty straightforward asset transfer agreement, it was smooth sailing and was a success for all the reasons noted. I don't think we had an AG or court approval requirement in that case. There wasn't extensive due diligence. It was quick and easy and not expensive. And really, at the end of the day, I think what we all want to highlight is that the program moved to Share, landed at Share, and has been wildly successful. Share has, in fact, used it to further the mission. And so from that perspective, it not only seemed like a good affiliation, it actually really was.
Yeah, great advice. And certainly something to the funders who are really putting on these podcasts, the Sustained Collaboration Network, are a great resource for funding all of those pieces, right? Making sure that there is funding for the exploration and planning phase for any of this type. So funding, bringing in lawyers, bringing in consultants, making sure that the organizations can have that due diligence period, because it does take time and it takes expertise to be able to do this well. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
You're so welcome. It was my pleasure. And I hope this helps organizations focus on their mission and move forward in a thoughtful and successful way.
Thanks, George, so much for being on the podcast. Can we just start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about the Share Food Program?
Sure. I'm George Matisic. I'm Executive Director of the Share Food Program. We're a food bank that's been around since 1986, serving folks in the greater Philadelphia region.
Wonderful. And, the the way we got connected is your participation in this research that we did about sustained collaborations, and particularly talking about your asset transfer and how you started to develop a relationship and eventually come to manage the Philly Food Rescue. What really started you to think about being in the food rescue business? You've been a pretty traditional kind of a food depository and distribution kind of center for a while. Food rescue is a different game. Why were you interested in potentially reaching out?
Yeah, it was really more about the size and scale of the food rescue that we were doing. So, we've always, as a food bank, we've always been able to receive large donations of food, and that's something going back to when we really first started to develop our food bank side of the house back in the 90s. But for us, in all of the work that we do, we're always trying to figure out how do we scale properly. And one of the challenges that we have increasingly seen is, first of all, in the United States, more than half the food that is produced goes to waste. And so for us at Share Food Program, we're always trying to figure out how do we get in earlier before that food is wasted, to be able to rescue that food and to deliver to the hundreds of thousands of folks that we serve every week that we know would gladly take that food when it's still good. And so we've done this sort of by the truckload historically, but increasingly we knew at the retail level, at the restaurant level, and other places that there was a need for us to have more interventions where we could potentially pick up that food. And a lot of food banks have been sort of exploring this in recent years, and it was something that we were looking at as an organization. And we had conversations with a number of other entities that are kind of in the food rescue space. But really in 2019, 2020, especially with the pandemic, when we started getting more and more calls from restaurants and other retailers, really at the beginning of the pandemic, that a lot of them were closing their doors, and we were figuring out how do we rescue all of this food at smaller retail locations. And we started having conversations with folks then. And originally, our goal was that we'd just develop something in-house. And when we started looking at it, we realized actually there's quite a few entities that already kind of did the work. And as we continued the conversations with a couple of our partner organizations, one of them who we worked with for a couple of years was Uplift Solutions, which is another nonprofit created by the owners of one of the ShopRite chains in our neighborhood, which is a grocery store. And they had approached us, and we were talking about partnerships, and then I had a conversation with the executive director of Uplift Solutions, who very frankly said, if it was something that you wanted to potentially manage yourselves, I think we could have that conversation. And so that was kind of how the conversations got started. There was a partnership that sort of existed for a year or two prior to that. And when we decided, we really wanted to go in and rather than build something that was already, kind of reinventing the wheel, we knew we had a good partner. And when we knew that they were kind of looking to divest and kind of refocus their mission, it kind of made natural sense for both organizations.
And I know from our conversations that really the process was relatively quick because it was an asset transfer. So it's not like trying to merge an organization. It really is about the transfer of a program from one place to another. But some of the trickiest conversations are really around staffing, right? So can you talk a little bit about the process you used to try to not only integrate the asset in terms of the licensing and all these things, but really there was this focus on bringing some of the staff over who were working at Uplift Solutions while it was still there, and really making them Share Food Program staff.
Yeah, and we knew if we were to build this from scratch, we were going to have to hire staff anyway, right? It was hire 4 or 5 staff to do this well, and so for us it was kind of a little bit of a no-brainer in that we knew that we had some staff over there who already had experience in running the app and the program. Now, for us, part of the situation was that Uplift during the pandemic had some other programs going on that they kind of suspended in the early stages of the pandemic. And so they shifted a couple of employees over to Philly Food Rescue, to that program specifically. And when we went to do the asset transfer, a couple of them kind of indicated, you know what, I'd actually like to stay with Uplift, and I want to go back to my original program I was working on. But that said, we were able to bring on one person full time that was able to make the shift. We had one person that kind of temporarily joined us as well. And then ultimately, what we were able to do was to backfill essentially those positions. But we had in Susanna, who came over with that program, still with Share running that program today. We were able to bring in somebody who had the experience and really knew the program inside and out, and then we were able to sort of build the staff around her that she needed. That was really interested in this work specifically.
And since it's come under the umbrella of Shared Food Program, the program's really increased the size of both the pounds of food and the number and the amount of food that's being delivered. Why do you think the program has grown so much since the asset transfer, since it's moved from Uplift over to your house?
Yeah, you think of it a lot of like when a mature company acquires a startup, right? Where you realize you're in the for-profit space, where you realize you're missing something, and that technology can really benefit in that case your company, in this case our organization, in a whole other way. And so what we were able to do was bring in that technology, bring in the partnerships, and couple that with what we were already doing where it kind of made sense. So first and foremost, just having the app and having those relationships, what we were able to realize was a number of the organizations, the grocers and whatnot we were working with oftentimes had donations that Philly Food Rescue, when it was traditionally housed with Uplift, weren't able to take in larger donations. So when they would get a truckload donated by a grocery store, they were unfortunately had to say, sorry, we can't handle that, because Philly Food Rescue is largely based on volunteers who go to pick up by the carload, right? And so what we were able to do is couple it with our big warehouses and our trucking fleet capacity that we have, cold storage capacity that allowed us to take in those larger donations. And we were able to couple it with our existing partner organizations who are already members of Share Food Program's Pantry Network. And so for many of them, they were able to then onboard with Philly Food Rescue, and then we had other outlets for us to be able to distribute food. So all of it kind of came together in such a way that was really taking the big logistics that we do with our tractor trailers and trucks and, warehouses with docks and whatnot, and combining it with sort of a smaller retail operation. And that really, it really helped us to sort of make our first steps into, sort of that, what we, has traditionally called last mile logistics, and took us to a different level than where we ever had been before.
And one of the things that so impressed me in our conversations is not only that this asset transfer benefited the program because it was able to accept types of foods that it couldn't before. It had new partners, new technology, but it also has been a benefit to Share Food Program. And so I know you've sometimes talked about it as a startup or kind of like the first team, like that AAA team, right? As we're thinking about it. So can you talk just a little bit about what's been the benefits for Share Food Program in bringing Philly Food Rescue under your umbrella?
Yeah, so it gets back to us, first with the technology. So for us as an organization, I mentioned earlier, last mile logistics are something that we had not perfected in. And in many ways, we're still in a very exploratory phase in 2021 when Philly Food Rescue came over. For us, we're really challenging ourselves as a food bank to consider, how are we delivering sort of exceptional service to our end user, our customer. And for a lot of that is developing, how do we eliminate any barriers to access? And one of those things that we saw across the board, for-profit, nonprofit, whatever it might be, really develop in the last 4 years has been around last mile logistics, getting food directly to the doorsteps of those who need it. And so for us, our challenge to ourselves is, if somebody of means can order food and expect it on their doorstep, order food online and expect it on their doorstep in 2 hours, somebody who doesn't have the means should be able to do the same thing. And so what our acquisition of Philly Food Rescue really allowed us to do was to think more about how we would be able to develop those last mile logistics in everything we do. So while it started in the logistics of getting, pickups at the local grocery store and taking it to, a community organization that was in need of food assistance, where we went from there was really thinking about how to further professionalize and develop the technology behind making deliveries to our end customer. So since then, we've used that technology in a number of ways, and eventually we were able to bring in a partnership with DoorDash, where we now are one of the largest DoorDash locations in the world, where we're actually taking food directly to the doorsteps of thousands of seniors every month who get boxes of food from us that we do either out of our main warehouse location or out of a hub location. And so what the acquisition was really helpful, or the asset transfer was really helpful in doing, is helping us think about scaling to a degree where we were really thinking about, our end consumer in all of this, and really centering them in everything that we do.
That's amazing. So I imagine that some folks who are going to be listening to this podcast have come to it because they've heard the term asset transfer. They think they might be interested in doing something with their organization, but they're just trying to make sense of it. They're new to the idea. So I wonder if you have any advice for them as they start to contemplate what the right format would be for transferring a program from one organization to another.
Yeah, it's all about mission alignment, right? It's mission alignment for the two organizations, and in this case, in the case of Share Food Program and Uplift, of us having conversations around what we were trying to do in terms of our mission, and really digging deeper into what our end goals were, and for Uplift to have the very candid internal conversations to say, hey, this is something that we want to phase out of, and we want to refocus our priorities on. In their case, they wanted to do a lot around workforce development, particularly for returning citizens. And so what we really were able to have that conversation with two organizations, and I'd say for us and Uplift, one of the benefits that we really had was pre-existing relationships and partnerships that we were able to build on. So we already had, Atif, the executive director of Uplift, and I had, some pre-existing, relationship, trust between each other. We could have those conversations in a very frank way. And sometimes that's the starting point that's needed is, hey, I know you're doing this, is that something you're interested in continuing on with, or should we have a conversation about that? And in our case, it was such a natural fit, and it did go so smoothly in terms of, the actual asset transfer in that case.
George, thanks so much for taking the time to tell your story and to really help educate a lot of folks about what you can do with asset transfers to benefit programs and to benefit your organizations. That's a really great story about innovation and the way that we can all do better if we can think about having those real honest conversations. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for being on the podcast, Michelle. Can you introduce yourself to everyone and tell them what your role is?
Sure. I'm Michelle Frerich. I'm the Executive Director at the Asian Youth Center.
Can you tell everyone a little bit more about what Asian Youth Center is, and just to give folks a context?
Sure. So the Asian Youth Center was started in 1989 in the San Gabriel Valley area of Los Angeles County. There was a large Asian immigration to this area, city of Monterey Park, Alhambra, San Gabriel. And at that time, there were not a lot of Chinese or Vietnamese speakers in school districts, in law enforcement, and social services. So a local school teacher and local city council person started up an after-school program and a parent education program to support low-income immigrant youth and families. And then over the years, the organization grew significantly. So today, we are a $6 million annual budget, 70 employee organization serving half of LA County. We serve people of all ethnicities, but we still have that deep cultural competency with the Asian immigrant community in the San Gabriel Valley. We do after-school programming, social services like gang intervention, reentry after incarceration. We also do community outreach and engagement, community education around topics, a variety of topics where there's gaps in knowledge in the immigrant community, and also engagement around civic engagement, leadership development. We do youth employment. We have a food bank program. So there's a lot going on.
Yeah, it's a busy organization that has multiple programs that you're trying to coordinate at the same time.
Exactly.
And the way you and I got introduced to one another is through this research that the Sustained Collaboration Network commissioned, looking at different types of sustained collaboration across the country. And one of the things that we talked about early in that is this moment where you began to consider whether or not to bring a very specific program into the Asian Youth Center, and particularly focusing on that parent and youth leadership program. So can you just paint a picture? Tell us about that moment.
Sure. So Asian Youth Center had actually gone through kind of a merger acquisition a few years prior to the one you're talking about, where there was another after-school program locally that was initially competing against us, and we went through a merger and they acquired them. They became a program of AYC, and it was very successful. And so, that scarcity mindset and that competition, that nonprofit Hunger Games mindset had really changed long before I was introduced to this particular program. And then the second thing that was going on is that in the juvenile justice and youth development sector, there's been a big transition in focus. We had a history of doing a lot of work with probation and with law enforcement, with kind of a deficit focus as opposed to a positive youth development focus. We were intervening after youth were already in trouble, after they were already in the courts, after they were already incarcerated. And all of the research and best practices are shifting now to focus on youth development, prevention, intervention, diversion, and youth engagement and youth leadership, youth voice. So we were actually approached by another program called the Youth Parent Leadership Development Program that had that positive youth development, youth engagement, and youth leadership and parent community leadership voice. They had grown out of a school, community schools project into this really interesting and really successful, deeply rooted in the community with youth and community leadership. And yet the lead organization that they were attached to was struggling to cover the costs and was downsizing. And so they were looking for a new lead organization to be a part of. They had looked at, creating their own nonprofit status and becoming independent, but they didn't really have any of the administrative infrastructure for that. And because of our background and geographic location, we were the youth organization that seemed like the best fit for them. But our culture was very different from the culture of this program. But it was really clear to me that the culture of this program was where the future of youth development was going. So I saw that as a huge advantage and a huge opportunity for the Asian Youth Center to bring in people who were really successfully running this, really new, but really on target, effective program. But there were some challenges around it, of course. But we did go through a process of vetting each other out and deciding to bring them on board. And it turned out to be very successful.
Well, maybe we can talk just a little bit about those challenges. You've already alluded to the fact that the culture was very different, and that's often a challenge that people bring up in mergers and asset transfers. Can you give me some examples of how the culture was different between the two organizations?
Yeah, so the culture was very different in the sense that the personnel at Asian Youth Center, the program directors, and a lot of the caseworkers and program staff had criminal justice degrees. And they had backgrounds from that juvenile justice, criminal justice focus. We hire a lot of young people. They work for us for 3 to 5 years. We promote a few and are able to keep them long term, but most of them go on to become something else in their professional lives. And a lot of the young workers that we hired at this time were going on to become probation officers and law enforcement. So there's a kind of culture and a kind of mindset that comes with that, right? And the young workers who were involved in the program, the Youth Parent Leadership Development Program, were people who had done ethnic studies and or not even gone to college. They were community organizers. They were grassroots community leaders. They were part of the defund the police movement. They were part of, a very different set of values and politics. And so their approach to things was very different and their skill set was very different.
Are there other challenges beyond the culture difference in bringing them on? So anything else that comes to mind there?
I mean, the other big challenge with this particular merger is that they didn't have a lot of independent support. So financially, I think there was only, when we did do the transfer, there was only a $25,000 grant that came with them. And there was only the potential for an additional $75,000 within the next year, which was not enough to cover the cost of the operations of the current staff and programs, let alone any kind of growth or investment in them. So we knew, looking at it from a financial point of view, that there was going to be a significant deficit, that we were going to have to raise a couple $100,000 within 6 to 9 months in order to sustain the program, that we were going to have to use our own reserves to keep it up and running until we could bring that money in. But because of the timing of the program and the way the program had really good outcomes, really good success stories, and was on that cutting edge of best practices, I was pretty confident we could get the funding. But I had to talk to the board about it, because when they looked at it just from a straight up financial asset acquisition point of view, it looked like a losing proposition. And I had to kind of negotiate for deficit investing in the program for at least the first 2 years in order to get approval for the decision to bring them on board.
Those seem like huge challenges to try to overcome, and it might have made a different executive director particularly wary of this particular asset transfer. But you went on and brought them in, and it has been a process for sure in bringing folks over and thinking about culture and really trying to help that culture percolate through the entire system. But you've had some amazing success too. So tell me about, this feels like high risk. Did it turn out to be high reward?
It did. It turned out to be very, very high reward. So, I mean, one of the things that helped us be successful with the cultural change was that we had gone through change management and culture change previously as an organization. We had spent several years implementing program evaluation methodologies, data collection, and creating a learning organization where we taught everybody to look at the data, not be afraid of the data, and learn from the data, and then adapt our programs to improve outcomes for youth. And so everybody, even though we still had that kind of probation or criminal justice mindset, they knew what the data showed. And they were on board with believing that the data is correct. The data is going to tell us the best way to move forward. And they knew that incarcerating youth doesn't work, doesn't create positive outcomes for youth. The data absolutely shows that. There's no doubt about it. So everybody in the organization knew this was the right direction to go. And they knew that they were going to be learning and growing and adapting. We talked very openly about value change and what it would mean. And we invested in ongoing training for everybody. And we brought the two groups together. And because the people coming in and joining us, they had to learn new skills as well. They actually didn't have the background with data. They didn't have documentation and data collection skills, data analysis skills. They were doing these very subjective success story documentation, which is important, but they weren't collecting objective data. They weren't even collecting demographic data very well. So they had to learn skills as well, and they had to learn that learning mindset. But we knew how to do that, and we knew it takes a while. We knew not to take it personally when people have conflict, and we knew how to have constructive dialogues about disagreeing and how to resolve those things and move forward. So we had a good skill set to do the culture change. And then my background prior to being an executive director, I was a development director. And before that, I was a grant writer, government grant writer. So I knew there was money coming down to support this kind of thing. I knew there was going to be significant funds. And I was confident that we would be able to get that funding. And I was correct. We were able to get more than $1 million grant that would fund the program more than $300,000 a year for the next 3 years. We were able to grow and expand. And we were able to partner with the county and share our model once we had done some good documentation of how the model worked. And the county was able to fund it through other nonprofits and expand it throughout the county. So we knew that this was going to be really successful and make a huge difference in the lives of youth and families.
And when we talked previously, we kind of thought about numbers that maybe the program, because the documentation wasn't great, was serving about 200 families, 4 schools, comes over, and a couple of years later, you're in 12 different schools and you're serving over 2,000 folks. That growth is really attributable to finding the right home that could really support this particularly innovative program and that can help give it the resources it needed. Sometimes folks, when they think about asset transfers, think, oh, it's just a way of divesting a program. It's just a way of, making sure that things stay the way they are. We're not losing ground. But in this case, you grew the program. You gained ground as a result of the transfer, which I think is pretty remarkable.
That was the hope. That was actually the plan from the beginning. Yeah. And it worked. It turned out great.
So every time you do a different merger or asset transfer, this is not your first go round in this, you learn something. What did this particular experience teach you about the benefits of asset transfers?
I mean, this one really taught me about the benefits of kind of long-term strategic thinking. Because the first one we did, it was an after-school program, very similar to the after-school programs we were doing in K through 8. There wasn't any real, it got us into another school district. It gave us a new set of donors and a new set of partners, but it didn't really change the practice at all. The thing about this one that was really unique was we could already see that our current program models and culture and values were on the way out. And we knew that there was new best practices, that there was a new direction that youth development was moving in. And we knew we needed to get on board with that. And we knew this program would be the solution. So not only did the program excel, but the program brought with it the values and the empowerment practices that could be learned by the other programs, even the programs that are still funded through probation. The way we do those programs now is completely different. And by cross-training and getting those values embedded in the entire organization's culture, we were able to go after new diversion funding. We were able to, really position ourselves to be an effective youth service provider in this new best practice area. And that would have been much harder to do without an existing program joining us, right? Because then we would have had to try to bring in people from the outside to train us. We would have had to, it just would have been harder. And we may not have been as effective with those youth in those new programs as we were once we had this new program on board and we had this new cross-training going on.
I can imagine that somewhere out there's somebody listening to this, maybe an executive director who hasn't considered the idea of an asset transfer before and certainly hadn't considered it as a potentially a strategic move, right? To take an organization from one place to another. I wonder if you could offer some advice about how they might go about considering this. What are some of the things that they should know up front?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing to know up front is that, you do need to do your due diligence. There were actually several other mergers we considered at different times and did a little due diligence and decided not to do. You want to know everything that's going on with that organization. You need to know the financial issues. You need to know their supporters and their partners and the kind of political issues. You need to understand their culture, and you need to understand their operations and program outcomes and have a real complete picture of it. I think the other thing is to have, a strategic plan as an organization. A lot of nonprofits have a strategic plan they do every few years. They put it in a binder and they put it up on the shelf. But if you're doing strategic planning well, you're looking at the way the field changes. Whatever field you're in, whatever business you're doing, it's changing. It's constantly changing. Your target population, the community's needs, they're constantly changing. And you're, as the leader, trying to anticipate that change, try to meet those needs, and try to prepare your organization to be able to do that successfully. So you want to look at that strategic trajectory, and then you want to look for potential partners or asset transfers that are going to help you do that. And that should be part of your due diligence. And then you got to understand that it's going to take years. Culture change is iterative. You make little changes over and over and over again, step after step after step. And it really took a good 3 years, 4 years even now, to integrate the programs, to get everybody cross-trained, to get everybody on the same page. And you have to do it very deliberately and very intentionally. And you have to give everybody a voice in the process, even the voices that don't want to do it. In fact, their voices are really important and need to be heard and need to be addressed and given an opportunity to participate, because that can sometimes change the way the process is done in a way that'll make it much more effective.
Great advice. Thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing your insights and story with us. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Sustained Collaboration Podcast. The Sustained Collaboration Podcast is a joint venture between the Sustained Collaboration Network and the Network for Nonprofit and Social Impact at Northwestern University. You can learn more about the Sustained Collaboration Network and download the research referenced in this podcast at sustainedcollab.org.